Today, let's talk about a 400-year-old company that did more than just sell spices. Get this, it commanded armies, it signed international treaties, and it literally wrote the playbook for modern capitalism. We're going to unpack the incredible story of the Dutch East India Company, the world's very first megacorporation.
All right, let's dive right in. And to really get a sense of just how powerful this company was, we've got to start with the money, because the numbers we're talking about are so massive, they're almost hard to wrap your head around, but they're absolutely key to understanding everything that follows.
Okay, so let me just ask you a quick question. If I said, what's the most valuable, most powerful company in all of history, what's the first name that pops into your head? I bet you're thinking of one of today's tech titans, right? Apple, Amazon, Google. These companies are worth trillions, and they pretty much dominate our lives. But believe it or not, the real answer is a 400-year-old company that sold spices. Seriously? Yup, no joke. At its absolute peak in the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company was worth the equivalent of trillions in today's money. Some estimates even put its value higher than the top 20 modern corporations combined. So the big question is, how on earth did a company selling nutmeg and cloves become the richest commercial enterprise in human history? So how did this all happen? To answer that, we have to rewind the clock way back to the late 1500s. And the story of this company's creation wasn't some grand, brilliant plan from the start. It was actually born out of a really chaotic, high-stakes problem that the Dutch were desperate to solve. At the time, Europe was completely obsessed with Asian spices. I mean, they were as valuable as gold, used for everything from medicine and preserving food to just making things taste better. For decades, Portugal and Spain had a total stranglehold on the trade routes, and it was making them fabulously wealthy. And, of course, the Dutch wanted a piece of that action. But their early efforts were a total mess. You had dozens of small, private Dutch companies all sailing to Asia independently. This meant they weren't just competing with the Portuguese, they were fiercely competing with each other. They'd all show up in the Spice Islands and start outbidding one another, driving up the price of spices. Then they'd sail back to Amsterdam, flood the market at the same time, and crash the selling price. It was a complete race to the bottom, and nobody was making any real money. So the Dutch government saw this self-defeating chaos and knew something drastic had to change. They stepped in with a brilliant and frankly revolutionary solution, one that wouldn't just solve their trade problem, but would invent the very idea of the modern corporation. On March 20th, 1602, the government basically forced all these rival companies to merge into a single massive enterprise, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, or VOC for short, the United East India Company. The main goal was simple: end the internal competition and create a single united Dutch trading front. Now, this is where things get truly wild. The government gave the VOC powers that no company had ever had before. First, they got a 21-year monopoly. If you were Dutch, only the VOC could legally trade in Asia, period. Second, and this is a total game changer for financial history, it became the first company to ever issue shares that could be bought and sold by the general public. For the first time, any regular person could own a tiny piece of a massive global enterprise. This basically created the world's first modern stock market. But the third part is the most staggering. The VOC was given the power to act like its own country. It could build forts, sign treaties, and even wage war. This was a company with its own army and navy. So armed with a state-sanctioned monopoly, a ton of public funding, and its own military, the VOC was now unleashed upon the world. Let's take a look at how they used this unique power to build not just a business, but a global empire of trade that spanned continents. So the company's brain, you could say, was in Amsterdam, run by a board of 17 powerful directors known as the Heren 17, or the Gentlemen 17. These guys made all the big financial and policy decisions. But its operational heart, its nerve center, was on the other side of the world, in the city of Batavia, which we know today as Jakarta, Indonesia. And this table really gives you a sense of the sheer scope of their network. From that headquarters in Batavia, they controlled this vast commercial web. They established brutal monopolies over the world's only source of nutmeg and cloves in the Spice Islands. They traded silk and porcelain from China, tea from Japan, and textiles from India. They even established the Cape Colony in what's now South Africa as a critical supply station for their enormous fleet. So the crucial point here is that the VOC wasn't just a company, it completely blurred the lines. On one hand, it issued stock and sought profit, just like a business. But on the other, it waged war, governed territories, and signed treaties like a sovereign nation. This hybrid model, a private entity with state-like powers, is the direct ancestor of the modern multinational corporation. There had just never been anything like it.
Now, as you can imagine, this immense, unprecedented power left a profound and deeply complicated legacy on the world. And this is where the story gets darker. We have to look at both sides of the coin here, the astonishing innovation and the terrible exploitation, because the impacts of both are still felt today.
After nearly 2 centuries of dominance, this corporate giant began to crumble. Corruption became rampant within its ranks. The costs of maintaining its massive army and bureaucracy became completely unsustainable. And powerful new rivals, especially the British East India Company, started chipping away at its power. Finally, in 1799, the Dutch government officially dissolved the VOC. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, the VOC's legacy is really two-sided. On one hand, it's a story of incredible economic innovation. It pioneered the very concepts of the multinational corporation and the public stock market, systems that are the bedrock of our global economy today. But that innovation was built on a foundation of brutal colonial exploitation. It used its military power to enforce monopolies, enslave populations, and extract wealth, leaving a legacy of violence and domination that lasted for centuries. And this brings us to a final, pretty provocative question that lingers from the VOC's history. If the very blueprint for our modern global economy was created by an entity that fused commercial innovation with brutal exploitation, what does that say about the system we have today? It's a complicated inheritance, and one absolutely worth thinking about.